even though they don't know about memory reconsolidation, might actually be triggering it. But by and large, I would say people who don't know about it will not be triggering it because they'll be missing some of those key steps. And it's like not knowing the combination to that safe.
83% of Americans identify as not very happy, which can hold you back and negatively affect your relationships and your business. On this podcast, we discuss the proven steps to happiness so you can restore balance and rekindle your joy.
Welcome to another episode of How to Be Happier for Entrepreneurs. Today, we have an awesome guest from across the big pond. Alun, how are you today?
I'm great. Yeah. How are you?
Good. And I'm sure people wouldn't ever guess by your accent, but where are you from?
I'm from Liverpool, home of the Beatles here in England.
The Beatles. All right.
So I live about 8 minutes away from John Lennon's childhood home.
Wow. That's pretty cool. All right. Well, we're starting right off the bat with history. That's awesome. Well, Alun, we always jump right in, man. We want to give our listeners just amazing content. And this show, honestly, we have some great stuff. But this show I'm really excited for because it's something that I've learned how to heal people in the last 6 months from you, partly. And it's just some fascinating strategies that can absolutely change people's lives in just literally hours. So let's just jump right in. From your perspective, I know you've been a therapist for a long, long time. Why do you feel that traditional therapy often doesn't fully succeed in treating trauma?
Yeah, I mean, before we start, let's just define trauma, because the stuff I'm going to talk about, trauma is that word that catches everyone's attention. But the stuff that I'm talking about I see it as a much wider definition. It's basically any psychological injury that still gets in the way of life today. So that can be the little t stuff, it can be the big T stuff. It can be emotional learning, psychological blocks. The thing that I'm going to talk to you about today covers all of those, but of course, trauma catches the attention.
Now, what does big T and little t mean for those that don't know?
So it's kind of a bit of an artificial, I think, an artificial distinction, because ultimately, who am I or anyone else to decide whether your trauma is little or big? But sometimes people will say, well, I don't really have trauma. I have these things, which were a psychological injury. So big T, people tend to think as like an assault, or maybe being part of a terrorist event or something like that. Smaller T or maybe the small things that look maybe smaller objectively, but nonetheless have a big impact on people's life. So I don't tend to like that distinction, but I just want to get across to people that what we're talking about here today, in terms of the neuroscience around this, it works not just with the trauma stuff. I mean, my book is called How to Remove Trauma Response, but it's much wider than that. It deals with any emotional learning. It deals with psychological blocks, psychological injury. So if you're listening to this thinking, well, I wouldn't really regard myself as having trauma, still include yourself in the conversation, because really, I wish we had a more encompassing word than trauma that basically met where the neuroscience is. But we don't. That's a democracy of the language, I suppose. But it's a much wider thing than what we're talking about today deals with.
You know, Alun, I started using the word childhood programming, and I understand that trauma can affect you after childhood. But I thought the same thing. So many people were checking out when I said, "Oh, childhood trauma." I didn't have any trauma. Like I would have said that, "Oh, so what? My dad hit me with a belt and made fun of me. That wasn't trauma." And now I realized that was trauma that affected my life for 47 years. So anyway, uh, go right ahead.
Yeah, and that's a good point. But the reason why I think that traditional therapy is not necessarily treating this effectively comes down to two words. It's a really simple answer, and the reason why is to do with memory reconsolidation. So memory reconsolidation is simply a brain mechanism. So it's a biological mechanism. We have biological mechanisms all through our body. This one happens to be in the brain, and it's relatively recently discovered. But what memory reconsolidation does when it's triggered, it will actually remove that trauma response in the widest possible sense. So it removes that emotional learning. And those therapies which don't explicitly seek to do that and don't also inadvertently do that, if a therapy does not trigger memory reconsolidation, what they're doing really, I suppose, is a managerial approach to trauma response. In other words, they're very good at getting you to manage but still keep the trauma response. So biologically, if you go into the brain, there's a brain pathway that still holds the trauma response intact, but is still liable to be activated, and then all the distress we feel can happen. And then that therapy is geared towards managing that. You keep it, but we manage that. Now, the problem with that is that it's arduous, it's hard work. If you're the client who's having to manage that the whole time, even if you get pretty good at managing it, it relies on what I think of as a hygiene approach. And I think of a hygiene approach because I get showered every day. And if I don't get showered every day, I'll start to smell. And it's a similar thing. It puts a lot of emphasis on the client doing lifelong work on a daily basis to keep the trauma response, to keep the results of the psychological injury at bay. And also it's liable to relapse because it's still there waiting to get triggered. So traditional therapy, and by that I mean therapy that does not trigger that brain mechanism of memory reconsolidation, it keeps the trauma but just manages it. And so the other kind of therapy is transformational therapy. And transformational therapy is that which triggers the brain mechanism. And so you don't manage trauma because it's no longer there anymore. The trauma response has been actually removed within the brain pathway. And so that's really the one answer, because this is the only brain mechanism that is capable of removing trauma response. And up until the back end of the last century, we didn't even know that that was even possible.
Guys, this is like drop the mic moments, right? This is like life-changing stuff. If you've been going to therapy like I did for 3 decades and went to 50 different marriage counseling sessions and you're like, what the heck? I really haven't changed that much. This is exactly why you haven't changed. And it's not your fault. You just haven't been guided through a process that actually works. Alan, that's fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about how, again, most therapy is counteractive and how they actually are creating parallel neural pathways that actually compete when the person gets into a very stressful situation?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things, just to kind of not to be too hard on traditional therapy, bear in mind that this is relatively new breakthrough in neuroscience. So, what neuroscience used to think, before memory reconsolidation mechanism was discovered, it used to think that when something traumatic happens and it has a trauma response associated with it, that emotional learning is stored physically in a brain pathway, just like there are pathways in the street, physically in a brain pathway. And then what the brain wants to do is it wants to remember this traumatic incident so you don't have to put yourself through that again. And so it then locks the brain pathway, and worse still, it destroys the key. And so neuroscience used to think you're stuck with that. We now know that's not true. We now know that there is a process. It's more like a combination safe, that it does protect the learning because it's pretty important learning when something traumatic has happened. But if you follow the right steps, you can actually open the safe and you can change the contents. So traditional therapy, which sits with the old view of neuroscience, it doesn't try to overwrite the brain pathway because, after all, to be fair, they didn't think that was possible. What it does instead is it says, okay, so we're stuck with that brain pathway, with the trauma response there. So what we'll do is we'll try and create and nurture an opposing brain pathway. It's like a football match, basically, or a boxing match. So you've got the trauma response brain pathway, and you've got this other brain pathway that the therapy is seeking to create and nurture and make that other brain pathway stronger. And so the client is then in a position where they say things like, I used to always do this, but now when this situation arises, I realize that I've got 2 paths to go down. And so what they're really talking about there is their experience of having these 2 brain pathways. So in a sense, that's great if it were true that you can't actually eradicate the trauma response in the original brain pathway. But now that we know that we can, it's a really suboptimal way of doing it. Because what the client is left with then is this constant battle between the old trauma response brain pathway, this new one that's being developed. And as you know, with any kind of sporting competition, even the best teams get beat sometimes. And so what happens is that trauma is still intact. It's still waiting to win that competition. And when things are particularly stressful and when things particularly resemble back then when it was created, then the nervous system will kick in, choose the old trauma response, and we get into relapse. So it's not useless, and it has helped people. But now that we know from this neuroscience breakthrough that we can actually remove the trauma response from the individual pathway, then it's just a suboptimal way of working with people, because you can either manage the trauma, have a competition that you'll sometimes lose and sometimes feel that distress, go back to square one, it'll feel like from time to time, or you can remove the trauma response completely, much like overwriting an audio cassette. When you've got an audio cassette and you overwrite it, those old songs aren't getting played anymore. It's the new songs. And it doesn't matter that you've had those old songs on that audio cassette for the last 20 years. When you overwrite it, those songs are gone. And you don't have to keep managing the audio cassette to make sure that, the songs that you don't like don't get played again. It is just done. And so what clients experience then, and I've experienced this myself as a client, not just as a therapist, but what we experience then is that it just changes. And so once the memory reconsolidation has been triggered, the changes going forward are effortless. And it's effortless because the old trauma response is gone. We don't need to manage it anymore. And so the changes that we're seeking to make are easy. And we don't have to put a load of arduous effort to maintain them because we're not managing anything. The thing that those other therapy approaches were trying to get us to manage are simply gone and don't need management anymore.
Yeah. So if you've gone to therapy again, like I did for decades, and you can't change this negative behavior, there's hope. And when we talk about counteractive measures, it's kind of like going to a therapist for anxiety, and the therapist gives you breathing exercises. Well, they might help a little bit. That's counteractive. What Alan and I do is we actually go to the source and help you to recode that neural pathway. So, Alan, you suggest and others suggest that negative behaviors in our lives actually have a protective purpose. They're actually serving a purpose, right? Can you elaborate on this idea and explain how understanding this can facilitate healing in its own way?
Yeah, definitely. So when change is difficult, so everyone we work with, and you'll know this yourself, Brad, everyone that we work with are remarkable people who make all sorts of change in their lives. A lot of people might be listening to this and notice that they make a lot of change in their lives, but this particular change is difficult. So what happens when this change is difficult? What people will typically experience is some sort of bodily response. So you might have heard people say that trauma is stored in the body. What's really happening there is that they're feeling it in the body because their nervous system activates. And their nervous system only activates because there is a prediction going on that says this isn't safe. So whenever we so what happens basically is that when a change is difficult, it's because a client is hitting up against their own nervous system. And so there are various approaches that say, power on through, etc. But it's really exhausting to every day use willpower to fight and overcome a nervous system whose sole job is to keep you safe, because it's pretty strong. So what happens is that when a client comes to see me, they'll normally say, listen, Al, I've got this problem. I don't like the problem. It's causing all sorts of other difficulties in life, and I want to get rid of it.
Can you give us an example, a real life example, maybe of overeating or something you see a lot of?
Well, let's give. I see so many different kind of presentations, but let's say a social anxiety, for instance. So I don't know. People in your audience might even experience this sometimes, where I'd really like to get on video, but I feel all anxiety around it, so I don't, even though I think it would be a good strategy. But whatever the situation, let's say someone has this kind of anxiety, so they might get invited to a gathering by friends. And they might even say to themselves, right, I'm going to this gathering. and they might get all dressed up and they'll head out. And when they open their front door, their nervous system really kicks in and it feels really uncomfortable. And they find a way just to come back in again. So they think, I'm not going to go, it's too much, and they shut the door. So they'll come to me and they'll say, look, Al, I'm sick of this. I really want to be out with people, but I'm finding myself increasingly isolated. I'm not seeing people. And I just feel very anxious whenever I get those invites. So they're saying something very, very clear there. They're telling me what their problem is, that they're really eager to get rid of it. I know they're eager because they're working with me in the first place. They're taking their time. They're spending some resources as well. So I know that they're eager to get rid of it, but the change is difficult. So the second thing that I know there is that there is a part of themselves, and they feel it in their nervous system. It feels not safe to move through that door, which basically says, okay, so you might want that change. But I think that if you get that change, things will be even worse than the problem that you've got. So the way I think about it is that the client always brings in what I've referred to as the invisible twin. So the invisible twin has this, the invisible twin is the part of them that is keeping them in the problem. And it's basically saying, if you drop the problem or get that change, I predict that you're going to have an even greater suffering. So let's say, take this example. Let's say because what we have to do then, once we know the invisible twin is there, our job basically is to explore it and take the stance of, let's make sense, let's figure out how. Let's figure out what prediction is kicking off the invisible twins, kicking off the nervous system. And so in this case, once we do some exploration, we might find out that the person says, if I let myself, and that's a great phrase, I'll come back to it maybe later, if I let myself get the thing I want, if I let myself go to the gathering, walk up to these strangers, start chatting away, then, so what is this discomfort? What's the nervous system predicting here that's going to be bad? And then they might say, well, then I'll get mocked and ridiculed just like Dad used to do. And so you can understand then, like you start off like, I don't know how this is going to make sense, but I'm pretty sure it will. And then we get to a sense of, okay, so all this nervous system activity is because it has a prediction that if you go over there, you're going to be mocked and ridiculed just like Dad did. And in terms of the price that you're going to pay for being over there, that's too high a price. So I know that being isolated is pretty awful, but we're going to prefer that awfulness to the awfulness that will come. And so that's a kind of real life example of what people are facing. Their own nervous system is acting often, but not always, but often from an outdated prediction that was learned in the past, an old emotional learning. So the nervous system has a prediction, now resembles then was pretty awful. I'm going to step in and protect you by making things so uncomfortable that you'll step away from it.
Yeah, or you take the path that I did, and when you go to open the door to enter that party and you feel that nervousness and you turn away, you either do that or you show up to the party with weed and alcohol, or weed and alcohol in your system. That's how I used to deal with it, and that doesn't turn out well either. So that's fascinating stuff, Alan. So if you're listening to this and you have a negative behavior, it could be social anxiety, it could be overeating, it could be depression, whatever it is. It is your body's attempt at creating a solution because it thinks that there's something more painful. But every single time when you do the work, when you work with Alan, when you work with myself, you're going to find out that that thing that you think is even more painful is nothing more than an untruth that was usually formed in childhood to get you through a tough time. So Dad is going to ridicule me. So I've got to not put myself in a position where Dad ridicules me, because if I lose my attachment to Dad, he's keeping me alive, and that's not going to be good, right? So why, Alan, are so few therapists and coaches familiar with the techniques of memory reconsolidation, the critical component of transformational change? And what challenges does this pose to the field?
I think the main reason why most therapists don't know about it is that they're not taught it. So I left my therapy training. I had never heard of it. I found out about it by chance. I had a chance conversation. It lasted an hour, and I'm glad it didn't last 55 minutes, because in the last 5 minutes, they said, have you heard about this thing called memory reconsolidation? And I simply hadn't. So myself, like all the other therapists who don't know about this, were never taught it when they did their therapy training. I think that's a function. I mean, I can't know for sure why people aren't teaching it as widely as it needs to be taught. But I think it's partly a function of the newness of memory reconsolidation. I mean, it's been around for over a quarter of a century, but in scientific terms, as the science community replicates, it's been replicated now over 30 times in over 30 different studies. So it's now accepted neuroscience. But after the first one, it would have still needed to be replicated. So I think it's partly a function of the newness. I think it's partly a function as well of the therapy profession tends to think in modalities in terms of particular therapy approaches like CBT or EMDR. So they think in terms of therapy schools. What memory reconsolidation, when you follow the neuroscience, does, it kind of breaks you free of those protocols. And what you do to is go to what the brain needs itself. A little bit like, so you're kind of almost reverse engineering. So if any of your entrepreneurs wanted to, make a certain amount of profit in a campaign, they would probably start with the end in mind and then work backwards. And so as a therapist who understands memory reconsolidation, I do the same kind of thing. I start off with, okay, what's our end goal? Our end goal is not to manage this, it's to remove it completely so the problem goes away forever. The only brain mechanism that can do that is currently known of at least, is memory reconsolidation. So I now know that I need to trigger memory reconsolidation. And then I need to ask myself, okay, in order to trigger memory reconsolidation, what does the brain need in order to bring that about? And then when I know what the brain needs, which basically is an activation of the old prediction followed by something that will break the prediction, like a mismatch experience that I can facilitate, then we start asking questions back like, okay, so what prediction are we activating? And that's the kind of thing that we were just talking a moment ago. So I think it's those things. It's not taught. I think the newness of it, which is exciting, obviously, means that maybe the therapy world hasn't caught up yet. And also the therapy world thinks in terms of protocols and schools. I like to focus on what the brain needs because it makes me more agile as a therapist and a coach. If I'm within a protocol and the client says, I don't like that, I don't want to do that, I'm stuck. But my clients will say that quite often because I'll give them the consent to say it. I'll say, I've got this idea, we could do it this way. If you don't like it, just say, because there's loads of different ways we can do it. And so when a client says, I'd rather do it a different way, when you're focused on the map, it's a little bit like when you get lost on Google Maps and you fail to take a turn, it can just redirect you again. It gives you that same level of agility because you're following a map rather than a protocol.
So, Alun, just quickly, what challenges do you think this poses to the field, this lack of familiarity with memory consolidation?
I mean, simply, it means that a lot of therapists are doing suboptimal work compared to the level of effectiveness that they could get for their clients. It's as simple as that. And when I was working as a therapist without knowing this, I just knew that there was a missing piece. I didn't know that it actually existed, but I knew that there was a missing piece in the work somehow. I understood the importance of the nervous system. I understood how powerful the nervous system is, that it's involuntary. So it happens regardless of our conscious choice. I always understood that was really in the executive. That was the one making our decisions for us. But I knew that there was something missing. And I think when a therapist is working without this knowledge, without this understanding, the trauma response and other emotional learnings can simply be removed. Unfortunately, even though they're acting to the best of their ability, and even though they're really good therapists, they're inevitably going to be working less effectively than they could do. Now, I'd say that, some therapists have an innate genius and will be kind of reaching, and even though they don't know about memory reconsolidation, might actually be triggering it. But by and large, I would say people who don't know about it will not be triggering it because they'll be missing some of those key steps. And it's like not knowing the combination to that safe. Now, you might be able to kind of do something which inadvertently gets you into the safe, but most of the time you won't be able to open the combination. Whereas this teaches you how to open the combination. And so it just means that while therapists don't know about this, their work is not as effective as they would dearly love it to be. Because therapists are really wanting to do a good job. And so their work is not going to be as effective as they would really love it to be.
So if Johnny starts school tomorrow at a university anywhere in the world to be a psychologist or a psychiatrist, is he going to be taught memory reconsolidation?
I don't know is the answer. I mean, my guess is not.
No, I don't
Um,
think so.
yeah, I think some people are beginning to, but I think in the main not. And when I talk to therapists still, they still have not heard of memory reconsolidation. They're still in the same place that I was when I first found out about it. Now, I think the word is spreading happily. Part of the reason I wrote the book is I thought I found out about this by accident, but people shouldn't be finding out by accident. So I'm going to push this. I think the work of Bruce Ecker has been obviously really seminal in terms of getting the word out there. People like Courtney Armstrong have written about it as well. So word is getting out there. But I still think it's not a standard in terms of therapy courses.
Tell us about your book and the essential tools and principles from your book that could help people self-manage their trauma, or I like to say their limiting beliefs from childhood programming.
Yeah, so How to Remove Trauma Response, that's the book there. It's a memory reconsolidation guidebook for therapists and coaches. But I've written it in such a way that it's really something that a lay person could read. I remember when I was going through my struggles, I would like to read therapist books and find out what therapists were saying and go behind the curtain there. So I wanted that to be accessible. And so even though it's aimed at therapists and coaches in terms of how they can do this effective work, I have had emails from quite a few people who said I've applied this to myself and got some good results. So in terms of how to self-manage this, um, it is entirely possible to do that. I personally found it easier to work with a therapist myself because I was being the client and the facilitator at the same time. I just found that quite difficult. But it is possible to self-manage this as long as you give the brain what it needs. So I would say that in the book, it kind of takes you through how to identify the problem that you're working with. It takes you through how to discover why the problem makes sense. There is a strand, there's a whole school of therapy that tries to treat people as defective in some way. I think this is a very radical overhaul of that, because when you take the stance that the problems that we are facing make sense, well, first of all, it doesn't assume that we're defective, but also it's true, because then we find out how it does make sense and we realize that it was completely adaptive and it really, really helped us at the time. It's just outdated now. So it shows you how to actually do the work in order to discover why your particular problem will make sense and put some language on your own nervous system response. And then finally, there's a methodology in there, which I think is easier with a therapist, but there's not to say you can't do it yourself, whereby you actually provide that mismatch experience that allows you to activate the old prediction and then break it. It's a little bit like a magician, really. A magician will always set up an expectation and then break the expectation, which is the part that makes you go, wow. And you're doing that to your own nervous system. You're setting up an experience where the nervous system is expecting something negative to happen and negative meanings to be associated with it. And then you give it an experience imaginally in terms of the way I tend to work, which provides a positive experience. Now, the imaginal stuff, people might dismiss that at first. And I even thought, I was even quite insecure about using it initially. But the imaginal stuff, your nervous system responds exactly the same way to an imagined experience as it does to a real life one. Now, imagined experiences and real life ones are not the same, obviously, but your nervous system will respond positively and negatively to a nightmare, for instance, negatively, or to a positive visualization, or to redoing an old scene. And so it's a real natural interface to working with the nervous system when your goal is to rewrite what the nervous system does.
Alan, you did an amazing job on that book. I read it a few months ago after reading. No knock on Bruce Ecker, he's amazing, but his stuff was really geared more towards clinical work, and it was sometimes hard to understand. Yours is just written in such a way, like you said, that the lay person can understand it. So you did a phenomenal job. I know over the years you've worked with a lot of clients and you've had a lot of success stories. Is there one that kind of comes to the top of your head when you think about just like, wow, how much someone actually changed in such a short time?
There's a lot actually, and I'm kind of tempted to just do a quick round robin because what I would hate people to think of is to be left with one story and say, oh, memory reconsolidation works for that. I could give you a quick round robin of a range of people. And then what you'd start to understand is memory reconsolidation changes our predictions, rewrites, overwrites our predictions. Everything comes from this sense of we're having a prediction of greater suffering. And so you'll see the versatility of this kind of approach. So the very first time I did this was with someone who had involuntary crying, would just burst out into tears. And it was impacting work. It was impacting their relationship. And I always like these cases where something is happening involuntary because we know that the change then has nothing to do with willpower. It's to do with the nervous system having changed. And so we did this kind of whole work around memory reconsolidation where this was learned. We redid a scene imaginally, and then it just didn't happen again. There's no effort involved on behalf of the client, but that problem that they were facing just completely stopped. On the reverse, I worked with someone who couldn't cry, who came in with lots and lots of rage, and that was affecting his relationship and so on. And so in his case, it was kind of the opposite. And what we learned there is that he had some stories around masculinity and crying. So he didn't know that he wasn't allowed to cry when he came in, but we did some work around that, which basically broke that expectation. And so he was in a particularly bad way because he just had a bereavement. And a bereavement is something that makes people cry. And so his fury and rage were kind of out of control when he first came to work with me. And relatively quickly, he was then in a place where the rage and fury was no longer a part of his life. And he was able to cry openly in front of his partner. So there's a whole range of things. You know, I work with people who have anxious attachment, who are very insecure in relationships, maybe even to the point of feeling jealous and anxious, and maybe even a bit controlling. And then their nervous system is completely calm when they're in relationships. People who have negative self-talk, people who have really, really bad self-esteem, think of themselves as really disgusting, don't put themselves up for opportunities. The really wonderful aspect of this, you see, is once you've done the preparation work, once you've identified the prediction, and you're ready then to get to the final step, which is to trigger the brain mechanism, I can turn up for work and pretty much know that in an hour's time, their problem will be gone, even if it's something as entrenched as that. Because once it's happened and the trigger has happened, then that problem is gone.
You mean it doesn't take decades like it did me?
No, absolutely not. This is the thing, isn't it? So there's a school of therapy that basically says you should always have a therapist. The way I think of it is a therapist is helpful, not necessary, but helpful while you have a problem. And the goal of the therapy is to trigger memory reconsolidation so you don't need the therapist anymore.
I love it. That's what I always aimed at. So from the day I started my coaching practice, it was, I'm going to give you the tools that you can use in whatever situation you get into for the rest of your life. And you don't need me anymore. You and I want to make the person self-sustaining. So if you're sitting there thinking, I
Just to
wonder,
go, just to go beyond that, though, once people stop working with me, they don't need tools because there's nothing to manage anymore.
yeah,
So
touche. I love it.
I mean, coaching is slightly different because, coaching, I might say, well, I want to lose 10 pounds in weight, or I want some business coaching, so I double my business or whatever. And then you might provide tools. But in terms of the psychological tools, once our problem is erased because that trauma response has been removed from the brain pathway, we don't need tools because there's nothing to manage.
I love it. So if you're sitting here thinking, I wonder if I have some of these underlying limiting beliefs that are driving my negative behavior, and you want to find out in less than 3 minutes, just go to unlocklimitlessyou.com/quiz and take our self-love quiz. It may be a journey, a step in a direction that creates this life-changing event for you. Alan, this has been phenomenal. I'm sure people are going to want to reach out to you, want to read your book. How can people best get in touch with you?
Yeah, so they can get in touch at freshtherapists.com. So if you're a coach or a therapist, you might want to work with me to learn how to do this for your clients. And if you're not a coach or a therapist and want to work with me as your coach or therapist, you'll be able to contact me there as well.
Awesome. This was
And I'd
absolutely
recommend getting the book as well. You can actually get this free on Kindle Unlimited. So any of you subscribe to Kindle Unlimited, you don't even have to pay for it.
Yeah, so whether you're a coach or a therapist, or you're someone just struggling with some type of negative behavior that you can't change, or that you're just struggling changing, go to Kindle or go to Amazon and grab the book. It's quite amazing. So that concludes another episode of How to Be Happier for Entrepreneurs. Remember, I'm on a mission to help 1 million people find freedom and happiness by reversing these underlying limiting beliefs. And I can't do it alone, so I need your help. So if you like this content, if you like this show, please rate it, please rate it, please rate it, review it, share it, whatever you can do to help us get the word out so that we can help change this beautiful world that we live in. Until next time, love heals all.
Hit subscribe if you don't want to miss out on more life-changing content. And if you're struggling, you don't have to. Go to bradchandler.com/contact. There, you can join the Facebook community of like-minded entrepreneurs, and you'll see a button to schedule your freedom and happiness call. See you on the next episode.